All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and get started. So what I wanted you to do for the warm-up was to try to create contextualization. So try to think of at least three events or things that you could use to connect to the prompt that is below about the women's rights movement from 1940 to 1975. So to start, Ashiana, why don't you go ahead and give this a try?
Can you hear me?
Yep, no, I can.
Okay, I was saying, I was gonna use the Industrial Revolution.
Okay.
I would say 1820s in the
Cut out.
Massachusetts factory.
Okay. So the little girls, that would be a good one. Anything else you got?
Um, I would say also during the Harlem Renaissance,
Okay. And what would you use for that?
the flappers.
Good. Very good. Can you think of one more?
Let me see. I guess during World War I and II, really.
Yeah. And what would you use for that?
Women were when women were able to work in factories while they're head, and that they actually, I think actually after World War II, they were able to keep their jobs and work full time.
Good, good. So for this one, I would want you to use World War One, since World War Two is actually during this time period of 1940 to 1975. You wouldn't want to use that as much because that could actually be more like outside information, or it could go along with a document that you might be looking at. But yeah, for World War One, talking about women working in factories and getting more rights that way. You could talk about flappers and how flappers signified women independence. And then, yeah, going all the way back even to the Wall Girls could work as like a foundational event, and how women first started to work in factories. So the more opportunities for jobs, the more independence women got. Good. Anyone have any other events that weren't those three? I can think of two pretty big ones right off the top of my head. So the New Left Party, that's actually going to be a part of this, Natasha, the 1940 to 1975 women's rights movement. So you wouldn't want to put that down, because we're trying to think about events before this time period to kind of set the stage. Seneca Falls, very good, 7. That's probably the first major event that I would also talk about. The temperance movement is really good as well, Lonnie, talking about how women had a big role in that. And then there's one more that you could talk about. I would say it's an amendment. 19th. Good job. So in case you guys are just a little fuzzy about the Seneca Falls Convention, that was the first women's rights conference. That's actually where they asked for the right to vote. The temperance movement is going to be led by women, which is kind of the big notable thing. So it showed that women had leadership. And the 19th Amendment showed that women were getting the right to vote, having more of a voice politically. So good job, you guys. And what you would want to make sure you do is you would define those events, but you would also have to connect them to the women's rights. So you'd have to explain it, even if it sounds obvious. So for example, the 19th Amendment might sound painfully obvious because it's giving women the rights to vote. You would still have to explain this politically gave women a voice that they did not have previously, which started to get them more independence, something like that. Okay. All right, let's go ahead with our today in history. Today's date is April 29th, and the year we're going to talk about is 2010. April 29th, 2010. On April 29th, 2010, President Obama gave the order to kill Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. Bin Laden would be killed on May 1st. President Obama gave the order to kill Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. Bin Laden would be killed on May 1st. All right. So a couple different things about this event. I find this event really, really interesting for several reasons. One, you guys might have been a little too young to really understand the pursuit of bin Laden, but Osama bin Laden was the mastermind behind 9/11. He had organized the planes flying into the buildings on 9/11. And so he had been kind of enemy number one for 9 years. And you have to think it was incredibly frustrating for the United States to have this enemy that we could not track down. Originally, he was in Afghanistan. He was living in caves in Afghanistan for a long time. We got really close to his location one time, and we bombed those caves, and we couldn't find anything of a body. So we thought we might have actually like vaporized him or killed him. And then a couple years later, or a couple months later, rather, he came out with a video message showing that he was still alive. And we kind of accidentally stumbled upon his residence in Pakistan. We had asked the Pakistan government if he was in Pakistan, and they said no. They lied to us. It's kind of still debated how much Pakistan knew Osama bin Laden was there, but he was living very close to a military industry area, so it's probably likely that they knew he was there. And then the big discussion became, well, what do we do? Do we bomb the building that Osama bin Laden's living in, or do we try to send in a tactical team or a strike force team, men, to kill him? And a lot of people wanted to bomb it, but because we had failed to kill him with the bombing, we were afraid that we wouldn't be able to like see if we had actually killed him or not. So because of that, we sent in a Navy SEAL team. They're called SEAL Team 6. And lots of crazy things came out of this. The mission did not go incredibly smoothly. We sent in 2 helicopters of guys. One of the helicopters crashed. And this is where we learned that we had silent helicopters. We didn't know this before. It was top secret information. So how silent helicopters work, which just by the way, silent helicopters, they're crazy. All right, helicopters are really loud. If you have lived in Atlanta for any stretch of time, you usually will hear a helicopter hovering, I don't know, at least once every 2 weeks or so. Those helicopters are 2,000 feet off the ground when they're hovering, and you can still hear them pretty intensely. Silent helicopters are so quiet that you'll feel the wind of the propellers before you would hear the sound of the propellers, which I just think is terrifying. They're also painted in a way that when they fly at night, you can't see them unless they're about 150 feet above your head. So one of these helicopters went down. Miraculously, none of the Navy SEALs on that helicopter died. They go in, they killed Osama bin Laden, they grab his body, they grab a bunch of different things from the compound. They blow up the helicopter, but they didn't blow it up well enough so that people could actually make out what it was. And then we flew back out. Now, technically this happened on May 2nd in Afghanistan, but because of the time change, Barack Obama made an announcement on May 1st that Osama bin Laden had been killed. And it started this really weird thing where people started like to get really excited. I mean, him being killed, I guess, was a notable event, but it did, even at the time, make me feel a little uncomfortable. Like I was living in downtown Atlanta at the time, and people just walked out onto the streets and started cheering, saying USA, USA, which was just a little strange. You don't usually see that in the United States, especially when it's celebrating somebody's death. But anyway, that is today in history. Obama gave that order to kill Osama bin Laden. Okay. We're going to talk about this a little bit today because we're going to talk about 9/11, and because of that, we'll get back to bin Laden. Okay. Now, real quickly, I wanted to run through one more thing about your papers that I noticed, which is the outside information. So for your outside information, you need to name, explain, and connect your outside information. Hold on one second, guys. They're doing road work outside my house, so moving to a different room so you don't have to hear that noise. All right. So for your outside information, you should think that you have a checklist of 3 things. You need to name, explain, and connect your outside information. Now, most of you guys are really good at naming and explaining, but connecting is the part that you need to work on. So if you look really quickly, here was the prompt, how did World War II change national identity of the United States? Here's a bad example. So Victory Gardens are another example of how national identity changed in the United States. That's your name. Explain Victory Gardens were private gardens used to grow food during World War II. That's your definition. But then some of you guys had stuff like this that helped make sure no one starved. And that's just a very weak overall answer when it comes to explaining how this leads to national identity. So instead, a good example would look like this. It would still have the same name and explain, but now what you're going to have is a much more detailed connect. These gardens show an increase in national unity and the American people trying to support society by limiting how much food they were buying so that soldiers could have the rest. So this is really connecting back to the prompt. So you just want to make sure you're focused on that. Someone asked last class, you know, when we were talking about the complexity of document analysis, could that count as your outside information? And I said no, mainly because you want to make sure you go through name, explain, and connecting your outside information, and you don't necessarily have to do that with that complexity of the document analysis. All right? Any questions about this? No? All right. Well, last thing before we get started then, this is what you guys should be working on this week. AP period reviews. You guys are very, very close to the AP test. We're really about 2.5 weeks away. So you need to make sure you're working on those AP reviews because that's when they're going to be due. They're going to be due around 8/15. And then for those of you guys who are failing, this is the thing that I'm trying to do to help you out. And please spread the word because you guys have a lot of peers right now who are not doing, hold on, is the connection bad? All right, let me move again. Is this any better? All right, so what you guys should be working on this week, one is your AP reviews. These are going to be due on May 15th. And for those of you guys who are failing, this is the major way that I'm trying to help you out. I cannot continue to just give out a ton of assignments when some students aren't doing the original assignments that I'm giving out, because what it's going to do is it's just going to continue to drop those grades. So this is the best way that I can help you, which is by giving you a test and paper grade combined. Most of that grade is going to be coming from just making sure you're completing this thoroughly. So make sure that you are doing it. And I really I don't know exactly how to encourage this for some students, but right now I'm just going to give the numbers out mainly just so maybe you guys can reach out to some people. I have 47 students failing right now. Of the 47 students failing, I would say probably 35 of them are not doing anything, which means that there's no way that I can help them. There's very little reason for why students should fail, honestly, this semester. I know that we have a lot of like crazy circumstances going on, but at the same time, trying to make the work match those crazy circumstances. So if you know somebody who's struggling in the class, I've reached out to them a ton. Try to reach out to them because I don't want anyone to fail. Second thing you should be working on is your test 2 additional points. This is due next Tuesday. It's a 30-question multiple choice test. It is unlimited time limit. There's no time limit on this one. And you go through, answer the multiple choice. Every question you get right, you get half a point back. You get up to 15 points back. But this is due on Tuesday. And then finally, I'm starting to post the crash course retakes. And those are on, I started posting them last night and they'll be posted today as well. So any retakes you need to be taking for crash courses, you can do that. All right, any questions? All right. Oh, one more thing, Hall of Fame. For my class, I like to keep a Hall of Fame for students. Usually that's related to grades for the semester and things like that. This semester, I'm just making it a little bit more straightforward. Anyone who makes a 2 or higher on the AP test will be in the Hall of Fame. So what will happen is in August, I will have a celebration dinner where I will take your picture. I will cater a meal for you. It will be the greatest meal you've ever had in your entire life, Willie's. And then I will give a speech in your honor, okay? So I just wanted to update that a little bit for you as well. All right, so let's get into notes. These are your last notes of the entire year. Title of notes is Reagan and the Rest. Oh, and I just found my chat had disappeared. So people have been asking questions. Yeah, Dylan G, test 2 additional points is optional. It's just for people who need points back on the test we just took. So you can't make higher than an 85. So don't do it. Yeah, you're going to want to start taking those period reviews pretty soon. All right. So title of the notes is Reagan and the Rest. We're going to run through the last couple presidents that we have had. Now, how history usually works with presidents is we don't get into presidential history until about 15 to 20 years after they've been president, which means we're still now just starting to like figure out how Clinton is going to be remembered historically. So for this purpose, we really kind of finished with Reagan. Reagan is the one president we've really started to analyze historically for enough time that we can get a good understanding of him. The other presidents will start to come more in the next decade or so. But I'm still going to tell you about some of the events that are going to mark their presidency. Okay, so let's start first with Reagan. So there's big trends that have taken place since the 1980s. The 1980s is called by a lot of historians the modern era. For the United States, that's when Reagan first became president. So most of our immigration is going to be coming from Latin America and Asia. And that has increased mainly due to labor. We have needed cheap labor, and that labor has always come from immigrants. You should kind of know that. by now, historically, our cheap labor has come from immigration, and that immigration has come from Asia and Latin America. Unions have died off, mainly because factory works have died off. As factories closed, unions became less powerful. Those factories moved overseas for cheaper labor. And those factory jobs have been replaced with jobs in technology. The last thing is upper class, so wealthy people, their wages have increased a ton during this time. Whereas lower and middle class have not. I'm gonna let you guys know I've been in my house for way too long. I started noticing patterns of people who walk by my house. There's this one lady who walks by my house every single day, and she's carrying a different type of, I think it's like a object to protect herself. So usually it's a baseball bat. Today it was a golf club though. So no one messes with her when she walks. Anyone still need this slide? All right. So then let's talk about Ronald Reagan. Very, very interesting president. Started off as an actor. So if you feel like Donald Trump is the first president we've ever had who really didn't have any type of political background, that's true, but Reagan had a very unique background as well. He was an actor in a bunch of Western movies. He did turn to politics before the presidency, so that's still a little bit of a difference between him and President Trump. He had been governor of California. And when he was elected in 1980, it signified the beginning of what's called the moral majority. And the moral majority was a group of people made by Jerry Falwell. And that's Jerry at the bottom. And Jerry was a very conservative Christian who believed that the moral majority was similar to the silent majority that Nixon had talked to, which is that there's this big group of people that are really, really quiet, but they want the United States to have still the same traditional values that they've had for a long time. Now, thinking about this in terms of history, the 1960s and 70s had been a big time period of change, especially for women. Women got a lot more involved in politics, and women's liberation was a really big thing. So women are working more, trying to be free from men. Roe versus Wade had legalized abortion, and just to kind of understand where the moral majority, what they hated the most, they definitely disliked abortion. They believed that it was sinful to, like they felt like abortion was murder, or they feel like abortion's murder. So these guys voted primarily based off trying to get old values back, specifically about abortion, gay marriage, and this is where the Republican Party became known as the Evangelical Christian Party. A lot of evangelical Christians still to this day vote Republican because they feel like it is the moral party of the Christian values. Now, there's a lot of debate going on about that right now in the Christian world, but this is where it got that start. Anyone still need this slide? All right, so what Reagan is most known for, though, is what's called Reaganomics. And this is where Reagan is still idolized today by the Republican Party. The Republican Party, when they're trying to endorse a candidate, they say he's the next Ronald Reagan because they view Reagan as the John F. Kennedy of presidents. The Democrat Party kind of idolizes John F. Kennedy and his image historically. Reagan is idolized the same way by the conservatives. So Reaganomics is very simple to understand. It's where you oppose high taxes and government spending. So you want the government to decrease and you want high taxes to decrease. There's one problem. The government taxes or the government spending never really decreased. In fact, during this time period, military spending increased a ton, and we'll talk about why that is. Now, this idea of what Reaganomics was basically if you give tax cuts to the richest people, the rich are going to spend more money. And what they're going to spend more money on is going to create jobs for poor people. So think about it like this. Let's say I pay less taxes next year than I do this year. And because of that, instead of me going to Willie's 2 times a week, I'm now going to go to Willie's 3 times a week. Because of that, Willie's is now going to get to hire more people. So my tax cut creates a job. There's a problem with that, though. There's eventually a point, and maybe Willie's is a bad example for me, where I would eventually stop going to Willie's. I mean, let's say I had no taxes that I had to pay. That doesn't mean all of a sudden I would go to Willie's 7 times a week. Maybe I would. I don't know. My wife would eventually make us stop. And guys, don't talk bad about Willie's in the chat. All right. So for rich people, this thing is going to happen the same way. Let's say for a rich person, all of a sudden they're like, hey, you know what? I don't have to pay as many taxes. So because of that, I'm going to install a pool in my backyard. And that way I can hire people to come build a pool. The problem is rich people are only going to build 1 pool. They're not going to build 5 pools in their backyard. So Reaganomics did kind of work in the short run, but it didn't work in the long run. Yeah, Lonnie, this slide does stop with business, I think. Check. Yes, it does stop with business. Now, the big lasting legacy of Reaganomics is that it led to massive debt because we cut taxes and we increased spending at the same time. And if you look at this chart on the right-hand side, you can kind of see what our debt was pre-Reagan and then after Reagan. So it was 1 trillion when he first came into office. It was 5 trillion when he left. To kind of put that in perspective, it would be like today if President Trump came in with $20 trillion in debt and he left with $100 trillion in debt. 5-time increase. Now, the problem is, while what Reagan did was not great, every president has basically continued this trend, which is why we're in such big debt today. Some have been exempt, Natasha. We'll talk about that next week. Does anyone still need this slide? All right. Now, one of the big things that Reagan also did as president was he killed the USSR. This is probably his most notable achievement. Reagan won the Cold War. And the reason why was because he realized the USSR was very sick financially, and that the USSR's economy could not survive an arms race. An arms race is a military buildup. So what did Reagan do? He started a military buildup. Here's the thing, though, that was pretty genius about what Reagan did. It was a fictitious military buildup. Now, the big fictitious idea of the military buildup was to try to take it to space. This was called the Star Wars program. This is where like fiction and reality kind of blur itself. So Star Wars came out 1977, Reagan's elected 1980. So Star Wars is a really, really big deal in the 1980s. And basically the idea of the Star Wars military program was to kind of build a Death Star. And if you've never seen Star Wars, the Death Star was basically this big ship in space that could shoot a laser at things. And Reagan wanted a big satellite off of Earth that could basically track any missile and then fire a laser beam at that missile and blow it up. Now, that can't happen. Even today, our technology can't really do that. At least we don't think it can. And it is debated for sure how much Reagan actually thought that this was feasible. So people who support Reagan were like, no, he knew it wasn't real, but he wanted to pretend like it was real. Other people were like, Reagan kind of thought this was real for a long time. And we kind of kept telling him that it wasn't. But the Star Wars program, which was officially called the SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, was designed to make the Russians think that we were building this Death Star. We even did things like we made plans for it and purposefully let Russian spies get those plans so that those Russian spies would look at it and be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe the US is actually building this. And it caused for Russians to waste hundreds of billions of dollars to try to duplicate our plans that were impossible to do. Between this and the war in Afghanistan, Russia or the USSR began to fall apart. So we didn't really, Jonah asked, how do we know like who the Russian spies were to get them? The answer would be, we didn't know that they were like, we didn't know exactly who the Russian spies were, but we knew that if we put this on like a certain computer, a certain type of way, that basically it could be hacked and that they could see it. But they didn't know that we knew that they knew. It gets kind of complicated. So Gorbachev becomes the leader in 1985. That's Gorbachev right there with the birthmark on his head. Most famous birthmark in US history. And Reagan begins to tell Gorbachev basically, hey, we know you're in big financial struggles. It's okay. Why don't you guys just break your country apart? And that's ultimately what began to happen. Anyone still need this slide? All right. So the Soviet Union is going to end with two terms. The first was this idea of political openness. This is democracy. So you're getting rid of a dictator. And the second is this idea of free enterprise and an economy. The government doesn't control anything or everything anymore. Maya, we're far away from the last slide. Now, if you look at this picture right here, you'll kind of see how the Soviet Union fell apart. So this wall that's being torn down is the Berlin Wall. People, if they had tried to tear down the Berlin Wall before this, could have been shot for trying to do this. If you see these guys right here standing on the wall, these are the Soviet soldiers who were designed to, or like who were supposed to protect it. They're not getting paid anymore because the Soviet Union went bankrupt. And because they're not getting paid, they're not going to shoot anybody. Because they're not going to shoot anybody, that's what causes the wall to get torn down. So Taj asked, is Russia still communist today? No, not really. They still practice this kind of weird system of like partial communism, partial free enterprise. But Russia's like really weird when it comes to their whole society and governmental beliefs to this day. Because technically they're a democracy, but Putin wins the election every time there's one, and he wins it by a ridiculous margin. Like 99% of the vote goes to Putin. Anyone still need this slide? Okay. All right, so let's talk about Bill Clinton. So when Clinton became president, the economy was really bad and the US was in a lot of debt. So Clinton decided he had two solutions for this. The first is called NAFTA. NAFTA stands for the North American Free Trade Agreement. What this means is that there would be no trade restrictions between the US, Canada, and Mexico, meaning you could have something built in Mexico and it would be the same thing as building something in Ohio. There would be no tariffs. There's one big problem with this, or what people were afraid of. People in Mexico get paid way less than people in the United States. So they were afraid that all the factory jobs would leave the US and go to Mexico. And that did happen. So more factory jobs did leave the United States with NAFTA, but it made prices of goods drop dramatically. So things became cheaper. The second thing that he did is he created a budget surplus. This means that the government took in more money in taxes than they spent. So we had savings. If that sounds weird or strange, it's because Clinton is the only president to have a budget surplus in the past 40 years. Every other president, Democrat, Republican, it doesn't matter, have had budget deficits, meaning that our debt has increased. Anyone still need this slide? Now, the thing that Clinton is most known for, though, was his impeachment trial. I've spent several today in histories talking about this, so we're not going to go through it too intensely. But Clinton was our second president ever impeached. The first was Andrew Johnson, right after the Civil War. Nixon would have been impeached, but remember, he quit. We've now had 3 presidents impeached, the third being President Trump. But Clinton was impeached because he lied under oath about an affair that he had with his intern, Monica Lewinsky. Again, we've already talked about this enough, but there was physical proof that he had had this affair. It involved a blue dress. This picture that you're seeing right here is from a very famous televised address that he gave where he said, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman." He did. He later tried to, his defense was basically he did not classify what they did as having sex. So he's impeached, but he is not removed from office. The Senate does not remove him from office. Does anyone still need this slide? All right. The 2000 election. The 2000 election was very, very controversial at the time. I think it's become less controversial, though, as history has gone on. And one of the reasons why is because the 2016 election actually had the same exact thing happen. So there were two things that were controversial. The first thing was that President George Bush won the Electoral College, but Al Gore won the popular vote. So more people actually voted for Al Gore. But you don't win the presidency by getting the most votes, you win by getting the most electoral colleges. What that means is it doesn't matter if you get 51% of the vote or 75% of the vote, you're going to get all of the state's electoral colleges. So if you take Georgia, for example, Georgia in 2000 had 13 electoral colleges. So if you win 51% of the vote, you get all 13. If you win 99% of the vote, you get all 13. So after you're 51% of the vote, the rest of those votes don't count, basically. California is really the reason why this is a problem, because California has become so democratic and they have the most people in the United States by such a big margin that millions and millions and millions of people that vote in California vote Democrat when it doesn't really matter if they have vote 65% Democrat or 51% Democrat. Now, the other controversy took place in Florida. This was because of a type of ballot called the butterfly ballot. Basically, you had to take a pin and you poked a hole into a piece of paper for who you voted for. Some people meant to vote for Gore and they voted wrongly. They either didn't punch the piece of paper all the way through, or they accidentally voted for Al Gore and George W. Bush. So about 100,000 ballots were tossed out. And people wanted to go through those 100,000 ballots and try to determine how people were actually voting. So they were recounting these 100,000 ballots. The Supreme Court says there's nothing in the Constitution that allows for you to do that. So they vote to stop the recount, and George Bush wins the election. Natasha, so the Supreme Court had about 5 members on it that were pretty conservative, or they had about 4 members on it that were pretty conservative, 4 members that were pretty liberal, and then 1 who was kind of back and forth. And so the 4 conservative members and the 1 kind of neutral voted for Bush. But yeah, it did kind of go based off of like where they stand ideologically. Anyone still need this slide? All right, 2 to go. So this brings us to 9/11, which up until COVID-19 was probably the most significant event that I had ever lived through. We'll see if COVID-19 ends up topping it. But September 11th, 2001, a terrorist organization called Al-Qaeda attacked the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. There were 4 planes that were used in the attack. 1 hit each of the Twin Towers, 1 hit the Pentagon, and a 4th crashed in Pennsylvania. 3,000 people died. It was the deadliest attack in the United States since the Civil War. It was the first foreign attack on the United States since the War of 1812. Pearl Harbor, you should Pearl Harbor could, I guess, technically count, but technically Hawaii was a territory at that time. It wasn't a state. So the United States had not had an attack on its homeland where it wasn't fighting itself. Civil War, they were fighting themselves since the War of 1812. So what this really did is it shattered this idea of American invincibility. And I think that's the thing that's so hard to kind of think about, since a lot of you guys weren't alive during this time, is pre 9/11, just no one really thought the US could be hit. After 9/11, that all changed. This started 2 different wars. The first war it started was the War on Terror, is what we call it. And the big purpose of this war was to go get Osama bin Laden. So I'm going to run through just a couple of terms really quickly for you. So Al-Qaeda was the group that bin Laden was leading. The Taliban was the government in Afghanistan. We told the Taliban, so the government of Afghanistan, that we were going to come in and we were going to take out Al-Qaeda. The Taliban said no, that we weren't allowed to do that. And so then we said, that's fine, we'll take you out first and then we'll take out Al-Qaeda. So that's the War on Terror, that's the war in Afghanistan. So we toppled the Taliban, we toppled Al-Qaeda. We've been in Afghanistan for almost 20 years. It looks like we're going to get out of Afghanistan pretty soon. But that's the first war. The second war is, while we're over in Afghanistan, we look over at Iraq, and Iraq has a leader named Saddam Hussein. And Saddam Hussein has some of the same tendencies as the Taliban did. Allah al-Akbar means glory to God, Jackson DW. So they're saying they're doing it as an act of God. So we see that Saddam Hussein has the same tendencies as the Taliban, and because of that, we do a preemptive war on Iraq, basically feeling like we are going to attack them before we think they can attack us. Other things that took place during this time is the Patriot Act was created, which was the power for the government to tap all of our phones, emails, and financial transactions. Now, they're not technically supposed to use this unless they determine that you're a terrorist. But if you're determined that you're a terrorist, the wiretap on your phone doesn't start now. They can actually go through and backlog all of your old phone calls as well. All right, anyone still need this slide? All right. Eli, let me know when you're done. The last thing is the Department of Homeland Security was made. This includes the TSA. So it used to be when you went to the airport, you could actually walk all the way to the gate. That was like a big thing. If you were dating somebody at the time and you took them to the airport, you didn't just drop them off at the front door. You actually would park your car, get out, and go walk them all the way to the gate. If you were meeting somebody at the airport, you wouldn't wait kind of by those escalators at Atlanta, Hartsfield, Jackson. You would actually go meet them at the gate. Eli, you done yet? All right, guys, and this brings us to our last slide of the year. Barack Obama. You've done 62, sorry, this is now your 63rd PowerPoint. Somewhere around 550 slides. Good job. So Barack Obama is going to be the first president that's not white. And his two big ideas that we think are going to be remembered historically, but we're really just guessing at this point, is he created the Affordable Health Care Act, which is also known as Obamacare. This allowed for all people to have health care, but it also forced everyone to sign up for health care. So there used to be this idea that if you were young and healthy, you wouldn't get health care because you don't ever go to the doctor. So, for example, I haven't been to the doctor in years. So maybe I wouldn't have health care, but with Obamacare, you had to get health care. And he also gave the order to kill Osama bin Laden, which was on this day. And that's on period.
Oh.
Thanks. I've been working on it. Well, guys, this has been very fun teaching you. We're still going to have class for the next 2 weeks. Those classes are going to look a little bit different. I'm going to try to help you get as prepared for this AP test as possible. If you have any questions for me, you can stay back. I'll try to answer them. Can you not see this slide? What about now? Yeah, I can't be your teacher again. Although I have a lot of students who are really looking like they're trying to stay in my class for another year. So again, encourage people to, do their work. Most of you guys that are in here are doing great. You're not the problem. But if you guys need anything, let me know. Make sure you're working on those things on my AP. Get your grade as high as possible. Take advantage of this situation. You guys should be able to get this grade very, very high. The grade policy is very beneficial to students right now. I know, it's an end of an era. Yeah, I'm not going to keep just the Zoom open for you guys. While I would love to do that, actually, I'm going to download this onto YouTube, so I'm going to have to close it. All right, bye, guys. Yeah, Keegan, I'm still doing that movie race. Seen a lot of movies. What's up, Henry? Well, Henry, don't worry about that right now. You don't have a final exam anymore, so I can't give you 10 points. That wasn't my choice. I wanted to still give a final exam. Jeremiah, I see that you had Willie's yesterday. Lucky guy. I haven't had Willie's since Sunday. Good to have it tomorrow, though. So pretty pumped about that. Will do, sir. Will do. All right, guys, take it easy. I'm closing this out.